Good afternoon, and welcome to our panel discussion today. My name is Summer Missoura. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at IPG Health. We are a global advertising and communications network, and we're the sponsor of today's discussion. So what you just saw was a sneak peek of our clinical equality campaign, and it aims to raise awareness about the lack of diversity in clinical trials. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the issue, so I'd like to start off by telling you about Sean, who you just saw there in the video. He's a 45-year-old Black man, and he lives in a small town in Iowa. He's an elementary school teacher. He's a single father who has 2 daughters. He works really long days, and he's been noticing that he's having intense stomach cramping. Like a lot of us, when we get these types of symptoms, we chalk it up potentially to stress. But he notices that he has some blood in his stool, and that drives him to see his physician. His physician immediately refers him to a gastroenterologist, and that doctor delivers devastating news to Sean that he has stage 4 metastatic colorectal cancer. So Sean begins a journey of radiotherapy, chemotherapy, targeted therapy. He starts to lose weight, and his daughters notice that he's different, he's fading away. Unbeknownst to Sean, 200 miles away from him is one of the best hospitals in the country, the Mayo Clinic. And they are currently conducting clinical trials for a new colorectal therapy. Sean doesn't know about their clinical trial, and they don't know about Sean. So the connection between them is never made, and there's that lost opportunity to extend Sean's life. This is the reality of clinical trials today. Black patients like Sean remain underrepresented in the clinical trials, even when their life is at stake. And Sean already has a higher mortality rate than a white male who would have colorectal cancer. So today I'm joined by an excellent panel with expertise in technology, healthcare, and patient advocacy. And together we will examine the issue from all of those different lenses. How might we connect clinical trial sponsors and patients like Sean, as well as the intermediaries like family and caregivers? We'll then explore the ways that technology could potentially close this gap of communication between clinical trial sponsors and underrepresented patients. Patients like Sean deserve life-saving options that come through clinical trials. So I'm going to ask our panelists to please introduce themselves, and we'll start with you, Erica.
Good afternoon. Happy South by Southwest. I'm excited to be here. My name is Erica Taylor. I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Genentech. We are a biotech company based in South San Francisco.
Ricky?
Hi, I'm Ricky Fairley, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Touch the Black Breast Cancer Alliance, and I'm an 11-year survivor of triple-negative breast cancer, and experimental drugs kept me alive.
Can you all hear us in the back?
We sound really soft out there.
Yeah.
Great. I don't want to yell, but I also don't want to speak. I don't.
That's so much better.
My name is Ira Horn. I am the Chief Health Equity Officer as part of the health team at Google.
Thank you all. So remember, please submit your questions throughout the presentation using the QR code of slido.com with the access code clinical equality. So let's get started. Erica, it's fair to say that this is an issue Genentech cares about and wants to improve. The first step to addressing the problem is obviously in identifying it. So based on your knowledge, what are the top 2 reasons why a Black patient like Sean will be less likely to be enrolled in a clinical trial?
Thank you. So we, can think about all of the causes of all of the health disparities that we see in the world, and think about things like institutionalized racism and social determinants of health. But that's almost too large to sort of wrap your arms around. The way we've been thinking about the challenges for increasing diversity in clinical trials really boils down to 2 things. The first is information, just people needing to know and make these connections of the experimental therapies that are being tested and understanding what that might mean for them in their treatment. And the second is access. We just heard about Sean living 200 miles away from Mayo Clinic. It would not be easy athlete, for him to be a part of a clinical trial, having to navigate traveling there and back, losing time from work, getting childcare for his two daughters. And so thinking about how we create more access in the communities where the underserved patients live is another challenge that we face.
Okay, so before we can really talk about how we might diversify clinical trials, let's delve into that particular point about information. Ricky, you mentioned you're an 11-year cancer survivor. You know better than anyone else what a patient like Sean would be going through. Can you tell me why it's so difficult for patients like Sean to learn about clinical trials?
Well, we've done a lot of research with breast cancer patients and survivors, and our data shows that, first of all, doctors don't invite patients to trials, especially Black women. We're not invited. And then second of all, there's a severe lack of information. And really, our health illiteracy is driving a lot of the health inequities from what we see. What we learned from Black women is that they don't understand what the science is all about, and they have this fear of the unknown. They think you're going to get a sugar pill and die. They have no idea what the standard of care is, and that no, you're not going to get a sugar pill and die in cancer research. And that fear prevents them from even engaging in a trial. So I think that all of those things happen. Even we even see situations where we've seen people, educated people who have experience with trials with other family members, really still don't even understand the basics of how the science works. And that lack of understanding and lack of knowledge prevents them from engaging.
Okay. So there's lack of access to information, and when you do receive the information, there's a lack of understanding. Ivor, we know that we live in a world where we Google everything, including information about clinical trials. You certainly represent the biggest search engine in the world, and you're familiar with that zero moment of truth, right? That point in the process where a consumer is going to do all of their research before purchasing something. How can you help with making sure patients can find the information that they actually need?
No, thank you. I think what's really important is that so much of health happens outside the four walls of the healthcare system. And we have people who come and are searching for information hundreds of millions of times a day. And we know that 3 out of 4 people actually go to the internet as their first place when they have a health question. And our goal as the health team at Google is to really focus on how can we help people navigate along that journey. And that means like making sure that the information that they have is from an authoritative source and it is accurate, but also making sure that we are making it accessible in ways that people can receive it. Some people like reading about information, some people like a video perspective. And so we want to make sure that we're meeting people where they are along the journey through that process.
Okay, so, everything you described really talks about information as being a determinant of health, right? So, Ricky, let me ask you, right? You are leading a patient advocacy group to help Black women with breast cancer find and understand clinical trials. How are you providing that much needed information in a way that patients or their family members can digest?
Well, we did a lot of research, as I said earlier, and we really tried to understand what was in the mindset of the patient and what was driving their decision making. And so we learned very quickly that the information has to be very elementary, very simple, and has to come from the right voice. And from our perspective, it's the voice of a breastie. Now, the breastie club is not one you want to join. I don't recommend it to anybody, but once you're in this club, it's unconditional love and trust. So we knew that everything that we had to communicate and educate had to come from the voice of a breastie. So we built a website, whenwetrial.org, that basically had Black women talking. So they could go to this place and see themselves talk, see other people who look like them talking. And we changed the pronouns from instead of going to Google and saying, looking for finding you and them, we found and talked about we and us. And we built a community around women who had been in trials, had experience in trials, explaining the information to patients who wanted information in a very, very elementary way. And basically, we try to teach breasties how to feel empowered with information so they could advocate for themselves. and go to doctors and demand the care they deserve and demand trial information. What we did learn though is even when the patients engage in a conversation about trials with the doctor, they still walk away uninformed. We try to close that gap and provide the information they need and give them access to trials on our website.
Okay. And how successful have you been at that?
So we did a huge social media campaign, and we did a radio campaign, and then we hit the road because I wanted to go where Black women live, work, play, pray, and slay. We went into the community to events that were already happening where Black women show up. And so we hit the road. We did 25 events across the country, and since last May, we've signed up 7,500 Black women for clinical trials.
That's amazing.
Much more work to do.
And just a point, for this audience, Ricky talked about women believing potentially that if they enroll in an oncology clinical trial, they might get a sugar bill. There are no instances where you are not receiving standard of care. Standard of care meaning something that has been trialed and approved here by the FDA in the United States, for example. So no one in a cancer trial is going to be receiving a sugar pill or a placebo. Just wanted to make that point. Okay, so Erica, clearly whenwetrial.org has been successful. It's reaching a lot of patients out there. Is there anything in the work that Ricky is doing that you feel your organization will learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we pointed out, just the insights of what is happening with patients on this journey is so helpful for us. Genentech has been partnering with you, and in fact, I think you're going to be there this week.
I'm going in from your
Yeah, so we've been working together with Touch, specifically because of all the great work that Ricky and her team have been doing, and currently working together on a breast cancer study, where you've worked with a social media campaign to actually start to bring patients into the study and to get interested in it. It includes first groundbreaking other techniques to sort of improve the experience of clinical trial patients while they're on the trial, using things like nurse navigators and how we can work together to do that. You'll learn as we go through this time together that conducting clinical trials is incredibly complex and highly regulated. So there's certain things we as a sponsor can do and things that we cannot do. But when we partner with Ricky and other organizations like Touch, we're able to really amplify our benefit there.
Wonderful. So, Genentech is one organization, Touch is one organization. You're specifically talking about breast cancer. There's a multitude of other types of cancers out there and other disease states. The problem needs to be to scale, right?
Yeah.
And in addition to that, recent studies have shown, while we're talking about oncology, that Asian patients, for example, while 6% of the population, they are also tremendously underrepresented in overall clinical trials. So we have to start thinking about how we might scale up and what we might do. So we need more than just a piecemeal approach, right? And we need a way that we as marketers and advocates and pharma companies can inform and recruit patients and have them stay in clinical trials. So back to the point earlier, we need to get a little creative in what we do. So do you have any ideas, Ricky? I'll start with you as to how we might tackle this problem in a creative way.
So one of my hashtags is be iconic. So I think creative is there, we have to be creative, but I think we have to be iconic. And I challenge our pharma partners every day to look at things differently because what has been happening has been done, it's not working. And I think we have to do things differently. And social media is very powerful. We all know it. I walk around with my phone around my neck, and everybody's attached to their phone. And so we try to use social media as a tool to reach our community. We know where to find them, and we know whether things are working or not, right? We know you can tell instantly whether your post worked or not. So we think that that's a really good way to do it, but we also know that video is very powerful. And so a lot of our social media is video, a lot of our content is video because people respond when they didn't see somebody that looks like that. So we use a lot of those tools, and also it's a little more economical than buying television. But we're very active on YouTube, we're very active on Facebook Live, we're very active on really all the platforms, Instagram, we do a lot of Instagram Lives. But I think that we have to give people easy to understand content that's bite-sized and meaningful, and they can take away a chunk of it and get what they need. So I think that sort of keep those messages really important.
Okay, great. So we think about the way, the credibility of the information, and then how we might deliver it. It doesn't have to be static. We can use a multitude of channels and ways that we can deliver that information. Ivor, what do you think in terms of how we can get creative?
Yeah, no, I think it's, I think, you know, as you said, information, you're talking about information and access. Like, these are two, like, really key points when we talk about clinical trials, and information as a determinant of health. I think one of the things that we've learned in our work is, first, we want to make sure that the content is authoritative, that it's accurate, that people are not providing misinformation. But what we've also learned is that people want to hear from people who look like them, have experiences like them, and there is that personal peer connection. So to Ricky's point, they want to hear from a rescue. And because they're walking a journey together and they want someone to support them in that journey. So our task is, how can we make that more consumer-centric, make it, have information there that we know is authoritative and accurate, not providing misinformation, but meeting people where they are. How do we raise up advocates like Ricky and Touch to make sure that we're bringing them to the fore so that people can find them?
And you know, that's tricky in healthcare, right?
Yeah.
It's a heavily regulated space. What do you think, Erica, to put you on the spot, about the use of social media to get people to enroll in clinical trials, right? It's a very unregulated space. You know, is there anything we should watch out for? What are some suggestions you might have?
Yeah, and it's a good point. I want to state for the audience's benefit and for my own, on behalf of Genentech, that marketers do not advertise for clinical trials. It's actually a huge violation in our industry, in order to so we don't do that. But a lot of the things that we leverage from the marketing lens, once a drug is approved, might still apply in this. One of the things that we have to think about, particularly as it relates to clinical trials, is they're changing all the time. And so when you talk about authoritative and accurate information, either as trials change, the information that's out there has to change. How do we make sure in some of these less regulated channels that the information is current and up to date? The last thing we want to do is to have a patient excited about their potential to be a part of a clinical trial that they're not eligible for. It's almost more defeating than not having the accurate information to begin with. So we think about other places to engage folks, not just in social media, but also out in the community, at places of worship, schools, community groups. These are all places where we can work with our medical colleagues to try to raise awareness on clinical trials. There is a website called clinicaltrials.gov, which is where all clinical trials in the US that are conducted, information on them is there. That site is designed for sponsors, I guess, and for investigators. And even as a sponsor, I have trouble finding our studies on clinical trials.
It's like going to Helpline.
Oh my gosh, it's so, I mean, even finding like where the study is being conducted, is it in your neighborhood near you can be really difficult. We view this as something that's ripe for disruption. What would it be like if we took this information, created a better user experience, and made it something that was patients? That would be really. And you know, and a challenge to all of you in the room who's work in the health and tech space to think about what you might be able to innovate.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I mean, our medical teams struggle with clinicaltrials.gov. You know, it's a wealth of information, but there are human beings putting in those entries, and it's not being done in a uniform manner. And so it could be a quagmire of information for a consumer to contend with, who may be looking for, you know, okay, I'd like to know if there's a trial within my geographic area, and trying to wade through all of the information that's there. So we're at South by Southwest. We have a lot of generalist tech brains in this room. Submit your, potential questions or thoughts as to how we might solve for this, right? It's a data-rich site, but it is not consumer-friendly at all.
Yeah, we actually tried to take the pain away from clinical trials.gov on our site. We actually have 4 portals that are very breast cancer focused. They focus on breast cancer trials. They still ultimately pull the information from clinicaltrials.gov. I think there's a lot of ways we can improve that technology to make it more user-friendly.
Right, a lot of great information there, but we need to make it more understandable and searchable. Okay, so let's go back to Sean. Let's imagine he or his physician do find out about that clinical trial at Mayo Clinic. He lives in a small town about 200 miles away, though, from the Mayo Clinic, right? And he's a single father, as we pointed out at the beginning of the discussion. He works. This can be a significant challenge for him. Erica, can you explain why clinical trials are usually conducted at places like Mayo Clinic?
So it's one of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, conducting a clinical trial is incredibly complex. You have to be able to collect data in very specific ways that allow for the statistical rigor that will allow the FDA to approve a new therapy. So you imagine, and just, again, I'm a bench scientist by training, and so you spend many, many, many years working on a new therapeutic or potential, and the last step and that last piece of that is the clinical trial, and you have to conduct that as well as possible to enable these new therapies to come to market. Because of the complexity, the staff required, the monitoring, the data sort of transfer between the sponsor and the site, you tend to go to places that know how to do this well. And so you end up going back to sort of the same well for clinical trial sites because they do this well. They can enroll quickly. They have great relationships with our organization and vice versa. And that can still be limited. And so we end up at places down the street, say more likely to be at MD Anderson in Houston than at UT Austin Medical Center here, because we know that that organization has been conducting trials. So that's one of the reasons why we end up mostly at the same places. We've been experimenting with partnerships and other ways to do something like a decentralized clinical trial. And this you can think of as sort of like a hub and spoke model. So maybe your hub is at MD Anderson, but you're able to get your monitoring in the community where someone like Sean actually is. So instead of going 200 miles to Mayo Clinic every month, he's doing his monthly monitoring at his local community hospital, small town general hospital that he's in. And that data can be sent securely and appropriately to sort of the hub that's collecting that. And so we're experimenting with some models of doing these kinds of trials so that we can reach these patients exactly where they are and lower the burden of having to do that.
Right, 200 miles is not something that can be easily done. And with clinical trials, you have multiple check-ins that you have to meet in order to stay enrolled, right? You could sometimes have to check in for your treatment 3 times a week. 200 miles becomes onerous at that point. And so you definitely understand why Sean would struggle with that.
You're also sick.
Yes.
When you're doing that, you're not feeling so great.
Yes.
Healthy, beautiful, lethargic.
And you still have all of your family responsibilities to contend with and your work responsibilities. Excellent point. Okay, so Ivor, we've been discussing here that, the research community needs to adopt a more consumer-centric approach. What can we do to help Sean when he's seeking information about what clinical trials might be around him?
Yeah, I think one of the things to think about here is, one, technology is only one part of this very complex process. Oftentimes people like Sean are going to a community hospital for their care. They're getting diagnosed at a community hospital. That community provider doesn't even know how to find the next clinical trial or the closest clinical trial. So making it easier, not just for the patient, but also for the physician or the caregiver in the community or in that local clinic to be able to find a clinical trial. I think is really important. We talked a little bit about all of the things in life that happen around a person. If there's a clinical trial, who's going to provide? Sean's a single parent. Who's going to provide childcare for him? Who's going to care for Sean after he's ill because he's having side effects from chemotherapy or for treatment? And so those are all very complex things to think about. And thinking about ways that we can democratize healthcare and make it such that people can find a clinical trial closer to them. One of the things that we learned during the pandemic, and for us, it's all about partnerships. We know that we only provide our role is to provide a small piece of the puzzle. One of the things that we learned during the pandemic, and now we think about now, is how do we give people more information that allows them to have access more readily? For example, when you use the search tool, we make it easier for you to identify a provider that accepts Medicaid. That is transformative for people who are looking for a provider who accepts Medicaid, because oftentimes they're calling the office, and studies show that if you call an office and you ask for a provider that accepts Medicaid, or if they accept Medicaid, your appointment is going to be much later out than someone who has private insurance. And so we allow and we make the ability for information to be available and to use technology for that to reduce those disparities and hopefully increase access. So I think there's great, but we don't that's information that is provided from those providers. We are not creating that information. We make information more accessible. I think as we're thinking about clinical trials, how are we making information about clinical trials more accessible? Why are we so dependent only on clinicaltrials.gov to actually provide information? I'm a researcher by training. I spent many years doing research on NIH grants and communication. I spent years putting information in clinicaltrials.gov. That is not a very good thing for me as a researcher to be doing. It is not going to be user-friendly because it looks like my grant application, and no one wants to read my grant application, even my grandma. So I think what's really important for us is to think about how can we make information accessible in a way that people can receive it, they can understand it, and they can begin to ask the questions to their providers and to those people that they trust, who can begin to help them along that journey and continue along that journey as part of the process. And so our task is, how are we democratizing health, and how are we making that information accessible in ways that people can receive it?
And, we want to make that information accessible without necessarily relying on, new gadgets or devices, right? So everyone already has a smartphone, but not everyone also has the level of internet bandwidth in different communities. So we have to think through the technology solutions that we come up with, and we also have to think through who the end user might be. Ricky, any thoughts on that and how we can get creative there?
I think one of the things too that you have to think about is people need to understand what a clinical trial is before somebody's going to be sick. Like it's something that we should learn about in school, in high school. It's something that we should just know as part of science, that this is part of science and healthcare. It should be a basic thing that we know about. So anyway, to do that, I know we've been talking a lot about using places in the community like Walgreens, CVS, and bringing the trials to the community and bringing them to places where people live. We work by a breath, but I think it has to be simple. It has to be understandable. As soon as you use a big word, I'm not going to engage in the conversation. So we really need tools that are going to deliver the message in a way that's meaningful and from the right voice, as I said. And I think as we built on the trial, it was all about the breastfeeding. It was all about me, you and us, and my sister, and your mama, and that's what we try to teach with making it familial. But we also try to teach our patients to advocate for their doctors and ask for that standard of care, because we live in a world of health and equity. There is no equity, and I don't think we're going to get to health equity until every healthcare professional, every doctor, every scientist treats people like they want to be treated, and that's what we teach our patients. You go back to the doctor and you say, whatever treatment plan you recommended for me, is that what you would give your mom, your grandma, your auntie, your daughter? Because if it's not good enough for them, it's not good enough for me. So it's basically arming patients with information and also with good stuff, with energy and passion and balls to say, ask for the care they deserve. And so it's part of just, I think a basic education about healthcare that you have to ask for, because you're not going to get it otherwise.
Ricky, one of the things that's so important about the work that you do and what you were talking about is when people go in and they have a diagnosis, we know that what they hear, they don't hear much.
They don't.
It just goes in the other out the other. And then in that moment, no matter who the people are around you, they're not experiencing it. And so you feel very alone. And having someone who's now walked that journey, maybe one step ahead or walking alongside you, like it, in addition to empowering you, it makes you not feel alone.
Right. Gives you hope.
It gives you hope. And then thinking about how are we using all the tools in our toolbox to help make sure that people don't feel alone in that process. And in addition to that, making sure that the information that they get is accurate.
We call that breastfeed lab.
Okay, so I know our audience was wondering, why don't we have something? This is 2023. We just came out with COVID vaccines in a record number of time. Like, what are we doing here, right? Why don't we have, a group mapping tool to help us with clinical trials yet, right? But it's a lot more complicated than that, right? Again, we're dealing with a very regulated space. Erica, what are some of the challenges with having the simple Google mapping tool?
Well, like I mentioned, in addition to the complexity, trials change all the time. That is to say, trials open and close every day, sometimes several times a day. Who is eligible for a trial is often very complex. So imagine if you're a patient looking for a clinical trial, the inclusion and exclusion criteria that you would have to put in starts to get close to HIPAA violations and health information and all of those challenges. So it isn't as simple as an open table around the corner, being able to sort of book your dinners tonight for in Austin. Yet, I still think that shouldn't, keep us from finding ways to innovate. Right? It's, to me, the size of the problem shouldn't intimidate us from moving forward. I think it is possible to do this in a way that does meet all of our regulations and can keep up. That's one thing I've noticed. I've been in this industry for 15 years. The pace of science is accelerating. Right. And so we need to be able to keep up with not only today's, but what's coming tomorrow with new innovations. So I think it's possible. We're sort of tapping into the collective genius in this room to try to think about ways that we could break through here and disrupt. But I will say it's not quite as simple as just sort of putting a nice interface on top of .gov.
Could never be that simple, right?
I think also, we have to realize that, our baby is ugly. And I think that, I think we're trying to do these pharma companies, I say this every day.
Yeah.
You guys, and thank God for these meetings are going to throw me out, but I think we have to think about the way that the things that we have in place right now are just not working. And we say, hold on, okay, we got to change how we think about it. And I think that's starting to happen a lot. And not much, but a lot. But I think we can just do more of that to challenge the system, challenge everything we do in a different way.
Okay, so, definitely a deep systemic, multifaceted issue that we're trying to solve here, but we still have to solve it, right? So as we wrap things up, let's just take a moment and think about it all. The title of our discussion is Innovating for Inclusion, right? All of us in this room would agree that we need something new, but innovations are usually designed for affluent, tech-savvy, well-educated people living in major cities with excellent Wi-Fi connections, right, and who have potentially a higher healthcare literacy. So I'd like to go back to Sean, think about, where Sean is. Sean is in Iowa. He's a single father, and he's living in a small town. And when we do start thinking about what the potential solutions are, keep him in mind when we are thinking about it. So, my last question for all of you, how do we innovate for inclusion? And I'm going to start with you, Erica.
Okay, so when you think about how we pull together innovation and who's in mind, who we have in mind, and we really sort of take the position of, you have to understand where the patient is, not only just physically, but emotionally on their journey. We're talking here today about cancer. We do a lot of work in multiple sclerosis. Those patients have often been on the journey for months before they have a diagnosis. So how do we get to their space, understand where they are, and work backward? Instead of, and when we call our baby ugly, and I would rather hear it because I can't fix something I don't know about, but the idea of sort of staying in our academic sense about how we might conduct something that's very high science, right? right, to approach every problem that way. With that, and with the human-centered part of it. One of the things that I'm really proud of at Genentech is we actually converted a building on our campus and built a patient-based studio. So we have patients, providers, and we use that studio anytime we were trying to think of a novel solution or something that we want to put in. So for example, we can simulate a doctor's office. We've built that studio with the help of patients, thinking about those who have limited dexterity, who aren't very mobile, who have nausea, who have these other symptoms as a result of their disease or their treatment or both. And how do we start to design with that in mind and go out from there? So we're really starting to get some traction, and we've got a panel of patients that we bring to campus to help us think through that. So that's one of many things that we can do. I'll make one other mention here, and this is really around the people that we employ. We do a lot of work around DE&I in our organization. The best way to get innovation is to get more diverse thinkers in the room. And so I'm really excited about the strides that we've made there. Lots more to do, but that's a huge component of it as well.
What about you, Ivor? Your last thoughts? How do you innovate for inclusion?
How do we innovate for inclusion? I love this question. First, I think for us, the way that we think, well, I'll start here. I'm a physician by training, and oftentimes when I talk to young physicians or medical students who are coming up now, I often talk to them about, when I started way back when, I thought about who were the people in the room with me. I thought about, I work with the nurse, I work with the respiratory therapist, I work with the ICU doctor, I work with parents because I was a pediatrician. And those were the people that I thought about as part of the care team along with me that I collaborated with. And what I remind them now is that actually you have an engineer, and you have a product manager, and you have a program manager, and you have all of these technology people who are behind the scenes somewhere who also play a role in what you do today, because technology has and will continue to transform the way that we practice medicine and how we think about health and healthcare. And so reminding people to think about, as we're thinking about clinical trials, as we're thinking about how we address and make clinical trials more accessible and more available, think about the people that you don't see in the room who are also a part of your team. And then start asking them those questions, because they don't have the experience that you do. They don't have the perspective that you do. And how do you bring that to the fore? I think that's really important, because one of the things that we do, and I love my job, is we think about equity as a core value of all the work that we do as it relates to health. And that means we are very intentional in being inclusive by design throughout the process, from research to our product process to our go-to-market process. And part of that is having a mindset of who's not in the room and who's not at the table. I can't do my work and our team can't do its work unless we have diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. We are very fortunate that we have a team that focuses on that, because if the folks in the room don't feel like they belong, they're not going to speak up. And everyone has something to provide, and I think that is really important. And so we try to have a mindset and try to encourage the teams and the engineers who are just like, how am I doing this programming? How am I thinking about this code? To say, design with the user in mind, not for them. We have a value as a company to respect the user. And that is core to us, just as equity is core. And so my reminder to them and my reminder to people as they're thinking about clinical trials, make sure you're designing with, and make sure you have the right people at the table, not designing for.
Wonderful. Okay, Ricky, I left you last on purpose because you represent the voice of the patient, the voice of Sean. Tell us, how do we innovate for him?
Well, I think that you have to talk and Eric too, that the key word is intentional. You have to be intentional in everything you do. Think about every step you take. You have to intensely think about the patient. And it's just a lot of the work that we're doing, and we're challenging pharma with and getting great response, which is, okay, what does the patient say? How do we work with them? How do we teach them? in churches, in the community, in places where they look like friends, I keep saying that, but like going out to the patients, looking them eye to eye and teaching them the concepts they need to understand where they live and going where they live. I think the one thing that's working really well for us, and we're partnering with Genentech on, is a nurse navigator program. So we're actually providing a nurse navigator who's a breastfeed to work with a child, and she's helping us recruit patients and then helping the patient to stay in the trial. Because even once you're in the trial, there's still challenges to keep the patient in the trial. And so we're working kind of full circle to try to provide care and information and support as the patient is recruited and also in the trial. I think one of the biggest things is the informed consent document. It's this huge document, sometimes it's 75 pages. It's like those pharma commercials where, you know, there's 2 seconds of this is a great drug and all, and you got it somewhere, you're going to cure it. And then, you know, 58 seconds of, you know, you're going to die, right? So I think that document is really difficult to manage. So we have our nurse navigator explain the document and help the families understand the document. Help that, you know, it's a family affair. That tumor in your body is not just your tumor, it's everybody's tumor. So we've got to really talk to the whole, everybody involved in the process, but where they live in their communities themselves.
Thank you. Okay, so I would like to now move to answering some of the audience's questions, and I have some of them here. So we'll get that started. So the first question, I'm going to direct it to you first, Ricky, and then maybe Erica for an add-on. How do we overcome historical, valid, and well-founded skepticism that Black and other underrepresented communities have with healthcare initiatives, including trials?
So, you know, there's this thing we call it the earned medical mistrust. And people are worried about it, but it's like a cloud over here. What's really driving the fear is not understanding what the science is about. And I think you can sort of say, okay, if you really understand the science and understand what standard of care is, and what an informed consent document is all about, and what, you know, kind of how the science is being done and conducted, you can kind of dispel that pretty easily and say, this can't happen anymore because of what happened. And now everybody's accountable for the research. And so if you explain it in simple terms, even simple terms like, you know that Advil you took last week? It was in a clinical trial. That hot medicine you gave your dog, it was in a clinical trial. So you break down the science, you can overcome the fear of that mistrust with information that helps them understand it better. And it's really that fear is more prevalent, at least in my work, than that mistrust.
And there, I know we talk a lot about mistrust, but there are studies that have shown that if a physician simply asks patients of color to participate in clinical trials, they will. So there's also a lot of assumptions of mistrust, which might prevent a physician from asking, because look, they are really focused on saving that patient's life. They don't want to wade into waters that would, you know, derail the relationship they may have with the patient. So the assumption of mistrust is also something that we have to get over as well.
And doctors tell us that they didn't introduce a trial to a patient because they thought they knew the patient.
Right, exactly.
Which is crazy, but patients want to do trials, they want to live. And frankly, if you're a Black woman under 40 and you get triple negative breast cancer, which is what I had, and I should be dead, I know I'm a blessing to be here, the clinical trial is your best bet. Right. It's the best science you can get, the best drugs you can get for your body. And when you understand it, you sign up because you want to live.
Of course. Erica?
I think both of those are great, right? And sometimes you kind of have to sit with the polarity of like, it is true that there is this kind of mistrust. And it is true that sometimes the belief about that mistrust is larger than it actually is for an average person. I think one of the things, and you know, I navigate this with my parents who are aging. I tell them, first of all, advocate for yourself. Ask for what you need. If your gut tells you you can't trust this physician, get another one. There are other ones. And you are just as empowered to do that as you are as empowered to ask for the health care that you deserve. My father went, he's got vision challenges and was looking for a really good ophthalmologist. And found one, didn't really like the first one he had, I don't know why. And I said, okay, let's get your number. And now he's been with this, his current ophthalmologist for years, and they've had a great relationship. So you have to kind of, it's a bit of both, but trusting yourself and knowing, when you have support of your community and your family around you to help continue to do that advocacy, I think that helps break that down.
I think also we encourage people to be the CEO of your own health. So it's your job to be the CEO of your own health. Don't your body fire you. You can take control of the situation and you can fire your doctor if you don't feel comfortable.
I think what's really, I just want to add a couple of things. One, trust has to be earned over and over and over again. It's not a one-time deal. You earn trust and you continue to be worthy, because you have to be trustworthy. And I think that's a really important piece of it. And I've been doing research in communication and healthcare for a long time. And one of the things that we know is that providers respond to patients' engagement with them. And it is the more questions you ask, the more they're going to respond to your questions. Because, I used to say doctors have their 15 minutes of fame people don't typically come to the doctor because they want to. They come because they have a reason to be there. And that 15 minutes of fame is now about 7 minutes of fame, maybe even less, of the actual time that you have with a provider, and recognizing that you want to get what you need out of that experience from them, and that they work for you. And being able to encourage people to ask questions is oftentimes when you have a peer or someone who has that experience, or when you're in a place where you need a clinical trial, that advocate or that caregiver or that person or that loved one that can play that role for you, and as well is really also very important. And people being able to share their information with the people that they love and the people that they want to share their information.
Okay, thank you. Another question, do you see recent advancements in technologies aimed at decentralized clinical trials, such as patient-centric sampling, as promising towards inclusion? Erica?
The short answer is yes. I think there are a lot of other ways that we can leverage technology for decentralized trials. It includes things like remote patient monitoring, wearables for things like multiple sclerosis. If you're trying to measure how far you can walk, you can actually just leverage a lot of the things in the technologies that we have today. I would say as an organization and arguably as an industry, we're just scratching the surface. And there's probably a lot that we don't know that we can continue to innovate on. And so I'm eager to continue learning. And even though it isn't actually my realm of responsibility at Genentech, but together with our health equity and our medical organization, really trying to figure out where we can pull this in and where we can try to example.
All right. Are we able to set thresholds for diversity and inclusion in clinical trial design? I would love for us to do that. Any thoughts, any of the panelists? Maybe you, Ivor, could we do that? Oh, Eric.
I believe that the participation rate in clinical trials should be commensurate with the burden. And a lot of the talk right now is making it commensurate with the population. That's not good. I had a disease, triple negative breast cancer, that Black women get at 3 times the rate of white women. And so any clinical trial for a drug in our space should represent those numbers. I'm not smart enough to do that math, but that it should be commensurate with the burden of disease. And looking clearly at the patients that are suffering from these diseases, and then figuring out what the trial participation should be. And I think that that's a huge challenge to get those numbers. But I think that should be the focal point.
And I want to make a point. That's not only the moral thing to do, it absolutely is. It's the scientifically accurate thing to do. We are drawing conclusions with clinical trials, huge conclusions that do not reflect the patient population. So we have a lot of blind spots when it comes to developing therapy when you look at it. So it's both a scientific issue and a moral issue.
We have an example that I just found. I won't mention the company's name because it's new research, but it's a test that breasties are given right when they're diagnosed that basically predicts their genomics or the biology of their cancer, and they make a decision to do chemo or not based on this test. And just recently learned that the test does not work on Black women. And so now I have this plethora of Black breasties who have taken this test, decided not to do chemo, but are probably going to die. They're going to get metastasis. And unacceptable. And when I confronted the company that makes the test, they said, oh, you know, Ricky, Black women don't have really good outcomes from breast cancer, and we didn't really have any in our trial. And that's unacceptable.
Any thoughts, Erica?
So we absolutely can set targets for the kinds of diverse patients that we want in our trials. So as a sponsor, typically when we're designing a clinical study, we know about how many patients we need to have in the study in order to show statistical significance. That's what we live and die for in our industry. So that's already modeled and already well known. We also know in many instances, and certainly the disease areas in which we focus, where the disease burden is in the US and often globally. So we can actually start to do that. We have done a trial in, I know we mentioned multiple sclerosis here, but we've done a trial in the US, it's called CHIMES, that enrolls only Black and Hispanic patients. And we're not excluding others, but the targets are primarily Black and Hispanic patients for MS because we know the burden of disease is different in those patients, and it is a worthy scientific question to understand how therapy works, how well it works, and what things we might do differently there. So these are starting to pop up. I think one of the other things that is known for our organization and many others is studies are often global in nature. And so being able to set these kinds of targets with the sort of uniqueness of the challenges that we face in the US can often be an organizational challenge when you've got sort of your global entity needing to conduct these studies all over the world. So that's something that we navigate in our organization.
Right. Well,
That's one of the things that we're doing with you for this specific trial.
Yeah.
We are recruiting Black women to be connected with certain disease, and that's great.
and it's an important point as to why we need to remember that clinical trial sites in the United States, we have the appropriate level of diversity in the United States to recruit. We can't make those broad statements for clinical trial sites that are in ex-US. Okay, I have a question for you, Ivor. Google knows a lot about its users. Could you possibly use this data to target some groups of underrepresented persons in clinical trials? How would Google protect privacy?
Yeah, this is me doing a little bit of myth busting, I suppose. Like, privacy is really at the heart of everything that we do. And we do not know specifically about an individual person. I know people have this perspective. We have very strict policies about prohibiting personalized ads. We never sell people's personal information, and we are in sensitive user information like race or health or religion are not shared with our partners. These are just for us, like no-goes. And so for us, privacy is critical and privacy is very important. So to Erica's point, there are some things that we don't do, and that would be part of it. Educating and providing information about clinical trials, helping people with clinical trials are available, making it easier for them to find, absolutely. But that privacy is critical.
Okay. Good point. All right. Question for you, Erica. What do you see as the biggest challenges in creating more PIs in the community? More investigators, yes.
So I'm getting a little bit past sort of my specific area of expertise here, but my personal view is the challenge is we don't build the relationships there. We build the relationships, particularly from our medical colleagues, often based on the numbers that we have and that we know. And when you don't have a diverse or as diverse of a medical organization as you would like, guess what? They go where they're familiar. They go to the places where they did residency and fellowship, and they go work through there, right? So I think that's one of the challenges is sort of, I feel like the bias I confront the most often is the familiarity bias, right? And how do we start to move past that and get into different communities? Building relationships with primary investigators is one-on-one, it's very personal, and it's rather analog. I'd love to figure out a way to use technology to at least identify where those folks really are and where we can build relationships there. But that would be sort of one place where I think it's really on us. It's really on us to challenge ourselves to go places that we haven't been before, to engage with community providers in the way that we haven't before, and to understand the unique dynamics that exist there as distinct from an MD Anderson, a Mayo Clinic, these research institutions where you're going to be institutions.
Right, there may be a hospital closer to Sean with an investigator just sitting waiting have the opportunity, have the resources and the information to run a clinical trial. But he or she just simply, they're not sitting at an MD Anderson or a Mayo Clinic with all those immediate resources at their fingertips.
And sorry, that's why I'm going to next week. I'm actually going to present and coach the group of PIs on this trial. And so you guys are bringing me in to say, okay, here's how you talk to Black people. Here's how you talk to Black patients. Here's how you recruit them. Here's how you staff for them. Here's how you take care of them. I think that's just a great opportunity. It's huge. And I don't think any other company is doing that kind of work. But that's our partnership. That's
Yeah, we're really, I would say, if nothing else, the Genentech a long time, we're at a point in our organizational growth where we're willing to confront and be vulnerable, and that comes from our leaders, myself included, and so that, creating that culture will enable us to start to do these different things, and sort of be okay being uncomfortable, and know that it's moving through that, it actually helps patients, and actually gets care when we need it. So
it takes a village.
Totally. And someone to tell us that they do something.
And I did it. And so on.
Yes, we do.
Question here, I think we have time for maybe two more. How do interested tech companies get involved? Well, certainly you can contact us at clinicalequality@ipghealth.com if you want to be involved in the problem solving. Does anyone else on the panel want to discuss from their vantage points how technology can get involved?
Yeah, I mean, we work, obviously, I said, we are building technology and making information more accessible, but we also work with partners and we work with enterprise, customers who are doing work and who are doing clinical trials and supporting them on how they think about their data, how they analyze their data to understand. I always talk about the denominator, like everyone's looking at the numerator, who's your denominator and who are you not including? And so really working with them to say, who are you missing and where can you go find them? Where are your gaps? Where are the blind spots? Where are the just like their food deserts, where are their clinical trial deserts, and how can you reach people? As we think about places like CVS or Walgreens that are now beginning to conduct clinical trials, then you have to think about okay, how close are they to you, and how are you making sure that where you're democratizing and decentralizing your clinical trials, you're actually going to places where there are people in need, and how do you do that? How are you working more closely with community hospitals? Because the majority of people go to a community hospital when they typically get their first diagnosis there, and how are you informing and educating community hospitals and making it easier for them and for their patients to access clinical trials and to be able to stay in their home space, to be with the provider that they know and with the provider that they trust, to be able to navigate through that process. So those are some of the ways that I think about it. How are you thinking about technology, and how are you thinking about what you build to actually support not just the patient, both the patient and the providers, and not just the providers at Mayo Clinic or MD Anderson, but the providers who are out in the community and the providers who are at serving the community on the front lines.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for today. I apologize for not being able to answer all of your questions, but please reach out to us after. I just would like to close this discussion by thanking the very brilliant panelists for giving their different perspectives on diversifying clinical trials and making equitable for all. Thank you, the audience, for your interest in this topic. As you can see, it's multifaceted, it's systemic, it's deep, but right now everyone's working in silos, and so we appreciate, everyone wanting to come together in order for us to tackle this issue. Follow us at Twitter at Clinical Equity. You can reach out to us at clinicalequity@ipghealth.com, and you can certainly go to our website, clinicalequality.com as well. And I thank you for your time today.